Today I will be covering the classical Durkheim theory, which was developed by Emil Durkheim in 1858 through 1917. He believed that sociology was the scientific study of society, but he didn't know how he was going to study it. So he said that sociology was a study of social facts. So social facts basically includes the factors of acting, thinking, and feeling that is external to an individual. And as a result of these factors, they control how the individual acts. And then Emil Durkheim believed that society was like an organism. So there was different functions that had to work together in order to keep it healthy. And when one of them failed, there was a social dysfunction. And he studied Europe and realized that during the transition of traditional to a modern society, there was an increase of suicide. So he believed this was because society moved from a high socially integrated society to a low socially integrated society. And as a result, he developed the classical Durkheim theory of suicide. So there was two causes of suicide, which was the social integration and social regulation. Social integration is basically when individuals voluntarily attach themselves to a group or society itself. And then social regulation is how individuals are controlled, constrained, and regulated by a society or a group. And he believed that if there's too much or too little of this, so social integration or social regulation, there was a higher increase of suicide. So in order for suicide to completely vanish, there has to be a moderate amount of each type. And for social integration, he developed two concepts. So egoistic basically means too little regulation. So an example of this, think about an unmarried person. An unmarried person is not really integrated into a family, so they don't receive love, attention, or any of those components in a family. So they're more likely to suicide. And an altruistic, think about there's too much integration. So think about like a terrorist group. They're in a group, they're very constrained, they're very restrained, and they're super controlled. So they're more likely to participate in actions such as suicide bombing. And then we go to social regulation. In social regulation, there's also two concepts. Anomic is when there's too little regulations. So think about a poor versus a rich society. In a rich society, there is less regulation, so people expect more from society. But when they don't get what they want, they're more likely to be frustrated, and as a result, there's a higher likelihood of suicide. And fatalistic is too much regulation. So for example, think of slaves versus white owners. Slaves were very controlled. They didn't have any freedom, so they're more likely to suicide than a white owner who he basically controls everyone else. And as a result, there was a lot of people who wanted to test this theory, and they found, so for example, Nick and Pope, they found that married people have a lower level of suicide than someone who's unmarried, widowed, or single. And then Stephen and Stack found that in a highly restricted political environment, people are more likely to suicide than in a lower regulated. And then we go to concepts. So there was a lot of criticisms based on social integration and social regulation. They said, how can we measure this? How can they make sure that we're actually measuring what Durkheim measured? So there was no exact definition on how to measure these concepts. So they developed a lot of criticism based on that. And then lastly, suicide. Suicide varies on the interpretation of the coroners, so there was no exact way to define what is suicide. So someone could say this is a suicide, someone could say it's not. So there was a lot of criticism on that as well. So thank you for listening, and this is the classical Durkheim theory.